A troubled history, America's long shadow in Afghanistan. This shadow, cast over decades, has shaped the destiny of a nation caught in the crossfire of global politics. Afghanistan, land of rugged mountains, ancient cultures, and seemingly perpetual conflict. Its landscapes tell stories of resilience and survival, while its people have endured endless cycles of war and peace. This nation, often called the graveyard of empires, has witnessed the rise and fall of countless powers. From Alexander the Great to the British Empire, and now the United States, each has left its mark, often with devastating consequences. America, despite its relatively brief but intense involvement, has become a significant player in Afghanistan's modern tragedy. The echoes of its actions reverberate through the valleys and mountains, affecting generations. The story begins long before the War on Terror. Afghanistan's strategic location has always attracted foreign interest. But the modern chapter of American involvement started in the late 20th century. In the 1980s, during the Cold War, the United States saw an opportunity. The geopolitical chessboard was set, and Afghanistan became a critical piece in the game of superpowers. The Soviet Union, America's rival, had invaded Afghanistan. This invasion was seen as a direct threat to American interests and global balance. The US, eager to counter Soviet influence, found a convenient proxy, the Afghan Mujahideen. These fighters, driven by their own motivations, became the frontline soldiers in a proxy war. Supporting these fighters seemed like a strategic masterstroke at the time. The US believed that by empowering the Mujahideen, they could weaken the Soviet Union without direct confrontation. The US funneled weapons and money, helping the Mujahideen bleed the Soviet army dry. This support was instrumental in the eventual withdrawal of Soviet forces, marking a significant victory in the Cold War. Yet, this short-sighted policy would have devastating consequences, plunging Afghanistan into chaos and laying the groundwork for the rise of the Taliban. The power vacuum left behind was quickly filled by extremist factions. America's actions, often driven by self-interest rather than genuine concern for the Afghan people, have left an indelible mark on the country. The human cost has been immense, with countless lives lost and communities shattered. The relationship, fraught with complexities and contradictions, serves as a stark reminder of the unintended consequences of foreign intervention. As Afghanistan continues to rebuild, the shadow of America's involvement looms large, a testament to the intricate and often tragic interplay of global politics. Cold War chess, using Afghanistan against the Soviets. The Cold War was not just a battle of ideologies but a complex game of strategy, where every move was calculated to gain an upper hand. The Cold War was a time of global tension, with the US and Soviet Union locked in a bitter ideological struggle. Each side sought to promote its own political and economic system, capitalism versus communism, across the globe. Both superpowers sought to expand their spheres of influence, often through proxy wars in smaller nations. These proxy wars were battlegrounds where the two giants could indirectly confront each other without triggering a full-scale nuclear war. Afghanistan, strategically located in Central Asia, became a pawn in this high-stakes game. Its rugged terrain and complex tribal dynamics made it a challenging yet crucial piece on the geopolitical chessboard. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the US saw a chance to strike a blow against its nemesis. The invasion was seen as an opportunity to weaken the Soviet Union by drawing it into a prolonged and costly conflict. The goal was simple: bog down the Soviet army in a costly and unwinnable conflict, much like the US had experienced in Vietnam. The US hoped that the Soviet Union would face the same kind of quagmire that had drained American resources and morale in Southeast Asia. To achieve this, the US embarked on a covert operation, funneling billions of dollars in weapons and aid to the Afghan Mujahideen. This covert operation, known as Operation Cyclone, was one of the longest and most expensive covert CIA operations ever undertaken. These fighters, driven by religious fervor and a desire to expel foreign invaders, became America's unlikely allies. The Mujahideen were a diverse group, united by their common goal of driving out the Soviet forces from their homeland. The strategy, at least initially, seemed to work. The Mujahideen, with their intimate knowledge of the local terrain and guerrilla tactics, managed to inflict significant damage on the Soviet forces. The Mujahideen, armed with American Stinger missiles, inflicted heavy losses on the Soviet Air Force. These portable, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles were game changers, allowing the Mujahideen to shoot down Soviet helicopters and aircraft with relative ease. The conflict drained Soviet resources and morale, contributing to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Empire. The prolonged war in Afghanistan became a significant factor in the weakening of the Soviet Union, leading to its eventual dissolution in 1991. The Mujahideen armed and aimed at the USSR. The Mujahideen, a diverse group of Afghan resistance fighters, became synonymous with the war against the Soviets. United by their Islamic faith and hatred of foreign occupation, they waged a brutal guerrilla war against a superpower. The US, eager to exploit this resistance, provided the Mujahideen with a steady stream of weapons. From sophisticated surface-to-air missiles to simple but effective AK-47 rifles, American arms flooded into Afghanistan. While the US saw the Mujahideen as freedom fighters, the reality was far more complex. The Mujahideen were not a monolithic group, but rather a loose coalition of factions with often conflicting ideologies and agendas. Among their ranks were individuals and groups with extremist views espousing a strict interpretation of Islam. These elements, empowered by American support, would later play a crucial role in the rise of the Taliban and the spread of radical Islamic terrorism. Section 4. Enter the Taliban, from allies to adversaries. The Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan in 1989 was hailed as a victory for the US and its Afghan allies. However, the victory proved short-lived. Afghanistan, ravaged by years of war and awash in weapons, descended into chaos. From the ashes of this conflict emerged the Taliban, a new and ruthless force. Composed primarily of Pashtun students from religious schools or madrasas, the Taliban promised to restore order and impose their strict interpretation of Islamic law. The US, initially indifferent to the Taliban's rise, even saw them as a potential stabilizing force. The Taliban, however, had their own agenda, one that would soon put them on a collision course with the West. Under the Taliban's rule, Afghanistan transformed into a brutal theocracy. Women were stripped of their rights, denied education, and forced to wear burqas. Public executions and amputations became commonplace, a grim testament to the Taliban's harsh interpretation of justice. Section 5. 9/11's shockwaves, America's fury, and Afghanistan's fate. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States sent shockwaves across the globe, forever altering the course of history. The world watched in horror as the Twin Towers crumbled and the Pentagon burned, leaving an indelible mark on the collective consciousness. As the dust settled and the initial shock began to wane, all eyes turned to Afghanistan, a nation already ravaged by decades of conflict. It was here, in the rugged mountains and remote valleys, that Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda network had found sanctuary. Bin Laden, operating from his safe haven in Afghanistan under the protection of the Taliban, brazenly claimed responsibility for the attacks. His words echoed through the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., igniting a firestorm of anger and a thirst for retribution. The U.S., seeking revenge and determined to dismantle al-Qaeda, issued an ultimatum to the Taliban: hand over bin Laden or face the consequences. The message was clear and uncompromising. The Taliban, however, refused to comply, insisting on evidence of bin Laden's involvement in 9/11. Their defiance was seen not just as a refusal, but as an act of complicity in the heinous acts of terrorism. This refusal, seen as an act of defiance and complicity in terrorism, sealed Afghanistan's fate. The US government, backed by a coalition of allies, began to prepare for a military response. On October 7, 2001, just weeks after the 9/11 attacks, the US launched Operation Enduring Freedom. The skies over Afghanistan roared with the sound of American fighter jets, signaling the beginning of a new and intense phase of conflict. American and allied forces unleashed a relentless air campaign, targeting Taliban and al-Qaeda strongholds with precision and overwhelming force. The bombardment was relentless, designed to cripple the enemy's ability to fight back. The US invasion, backed by overwhelming military might, quickly toppled the Taliban regime. Kabul fell, and the world watched as the once dominant Taliban fighters fled into the shadows. Yet the victory proved Pyrrhic. The initial triumph masked the complexities and challenges that lay ahead in rebuilding a nation and securing lasting peace. The Taliban, though driven from power, simply melted away into the rugged Afghan countryside, biding their time for a resurgence. The mountainous terrain provided the perfect cover for their guerrilla tactics, setting the stage for a prolonged and grueling conflict that would test the resolve of the international community for years to come. Section 6. Operation Enduring Freedom, a promise of liberation and chaos. The U.S. invasion of Afghanistan was sold to the American public and the world as a just war, a mission to liberate the Afghan people from the oppressive rule of the Taliban and dismantle al-Qaeda. There was an initial wave of optimism as U.S.-led forces entered Kabul, the Afghan capital, greeted by cheering crowds. The Taliban, it seemed, had been vanquished, and a new era of peace and prosperity beckoned for Afghanistan. The reality, however, proved far more complicated. The U.S., focused on hunting down al-Qaeda remnants, struggled to fill the power vacuum left by the Taliban's collapse. Afghanistan once again descended into chaos. Warlords and militias, many with their own agendas and rivalries, vied for control. Corruption flourished, undermining efforts to rebuild the country. The promise of a stable and democratic Afghanistan seemed increasingly elusive. Section 7. Nation building or just building bases? America's conflicting goals. The U.S. invasion of Afghanistan was followed by a protracted and costly nation-building effort. Billions of dollars were poured into rebuilding infrastructure, establishing a new government and training Afghan security forces. The U.S., however, seemed to have conflicting goals in Afghanistan. On the one hand, it sought to create a stable and democratic state, an ally in the fight against terrorism. On the other hand, it remained fixated on maintaining a military presence in the region. The construction of massive military bases, such as Bagram Airfield, underscored America's strategic interests in South Asia. These bases, strategically located near rivals like Iran and China, allowed the U.S. to project power and monitor regional developments. The emphasis on military solutions, however, often came at the expense of addressing the root causes of instability in Afghanistan. Poverty, corruption, and lack of opportunities continued to fuel the insurgency, undermining efforts to build a lasting peace.